Usually they get kind of groomed or gaslighted by the music industry with a different set of success metrics, which are chart hits or streaming numbers or awards, this kind of thing. This existential need around making art gets really skewed by the idea of commerce.
That's Keith Jopling, music strategist, podcaster, mentor, and author of Riding the Rollercoaster. After studying the careers of a number of successful artists, he believes one of the biggest mistakes musicians make is measuring success by the wrong metrics, instead of focusing on what actually sustains a creative career.
You get to this point where you realize you're in it for the long game as long as you want to be, because you don't have to rely on anyone else. And that's the real die-hard artist that makes it across to the other side.
In this episode, you'll learn the real secret to music longevity, why success looks different than most people think, and how artists can build careers that aren't dependent on trends, platforms, or algorithms. Stick around. I'm Bobby Owsinski, and this is the Inner Circle podcast. What do all successful artists or bands have in common that you've seen?
They have a way of keeping on, as opposed to all of those that fall by the wayside. And of course, the dynamic is different from solo artists to bands, and to some extent across the spectrum of both of those. But there's something about those that don't give up. They find a way. And, you know, sometimes it amounts to they're luckier, and they would admit it. You know, that's what I love. They're so self-aware, most artists, which I really love, that admit to being luckier. But I guess they make their own luck to some extent. And, you know, in the book, I talk about crossing the Rubicon. So getting to the other side, where you get to this point where you realize you're in it for the long game as long as you want to be, because you don't have to rely on anyone else. And that's the real die-hard artist that makes it across to the other side. To some extent, it's those that can't do anything else. But to others, it's that ability, that tenacity to hold on, to keep going, to keep grafting, irrespective of all the creative and the commercial stuff.
Well, you know, there's a distinction between, as you just made, between artists and bands. Is the era of the band over?
These are the questions I love, because no one knows the answers. And, you know, to some extent, I'm trying to dive in and solve mysteries with both the books I've done. So the first one about the album, and this one, Riding the Rollercoaster. Because I think bands are a miracle. And there are more bands being formed than ever before, right? You get these people come together in the same time and place, but they're all different. They all play different stuff, and they all have different takes on success and what kind of music they want to make. And so a band is a really complex thing. But there are just more bands being formed than ever. And I think if you even just look at it from the perspective of a numbers game, then yeah, sure, a lower proportion of the bands that are forming now and have formed in the last few years, and even those that have got to make a record, a lower proportion of those bands than ever will go on to be successful. But there are so many of them. I think we're still going to have, you and I are still going to be listening to bands in 20 years' time. They'll find a way. You know, it's unconventional. It's not what it used to be, and it's harder, but they'll find a way.
Now, your perspective is from the UK. My perspective is from Los Angeles, and I say Los Angeles as opposed to the United States because it is different here.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I've noticed and has really sticks out to me over the last few years, I don't hear garage bands practicing. I used to be able to walk around my neighborhood and I'd hear bands, you know, on a Saturday afternoon, 7:00 at night after work, I'd hear them practicing. I haven't heard that in years, and that scares me.
It would scare me too. I mean, I don't think that's the experience I'm witnessing here in the UK. So that could be a difference. And I'm wondering whether that's an LA thing, because I'm certainly aware of like a lot of US bands that keep cropping up on my feeds. And a lot of them seem to be new. I'm optimistic because I almost feel the opposite. It's not like I'm walking along the streets and hearing them practice in, out of their garage, but I went along to, it was a launch party in London last week for a new streaming service called Cantilever. It's kind of a new niche idea, and I think it's a cool idea. But essentially it was a bunch of bands. And, a couple of solo artists, a couple of bands. There was one band came on, a trio, young trio, really cool. When they got going, I thought, this is actually, these guys are really good. They're called Shaking Hand. And I met them afterwards, and I asked them about their influences, and their influences are like Radiohead, Pavement, a band called Woman, which is where they get the Shaking Hand title from. I think that was from one of their songs, and I don't know that band. So they ended up, helping me discover a new old band. All these bands were like influencing that were influencing them were from before they were born. And I think I think it's great. I think it's fantastic. The miracle continues, and I'm optimistic because there seem to be more kids picking up guitars and bass and drums and keyboards and making bands than I've ever come across before. So it might just be an LA thing, or it might be that you're walking down different streets. I don't know. You have to tell me more. You'll have to investigate more on your side.
Well, one thing I do know is, for want of a better term, a regional bias with this. For instance, in the South around Florida, there are lots of bands, and mostly because there are lots of places to play. One of the big problems that I see today is the fact that there are fewer and fewer venues. And if a band can't play in front of people, they get bored quickly. So that's one of the problems. And Los Angeles has been notorious for pay to play, first of all, and just not having a lot of venues to begin with. Although I see there's more popping up these days. So I think that has a lot to do with it, the venues. And how have you found it in the UK in terms of just the number of venues available?
Yeah, same problem. I mean, we're getting organized around it. The Music Venue Trust is super organized and motivated. They've been making waves. They've been protecting venues. They've been campaigning. We got our head around the problem, but it's a huge problem. And the grassroots of the industry everywhere, rehearsal spaces, small venues to play, are in crisis. At the same time as the value's been sucked out of the industry at a sort of finance, tech, and capital level. It's crazy what's happening. It's almost like this is a very futuristic scenario that we're living in, And for artists, of course, it's a type of crisis. But what I love is that, like I said, it doesn't seem to stop anyone trying, at least.
Yeah. Well, I come from a different era. When I grew up, there were tons of places to play. I mean, in the little town of 5,000 I grew up, there must have been 5 venues. And basically, there was a church on every corner. If it wasn't a church, it was a bar that had bands.
Yeah.
So I was playing I was playing 4 nights a week in front of people when I was a sophomore in high school, my second year in high school.
Yeah.
And from then on, and making a good amount of money and doing it, which is, now you're just happy if you play in front of people, let alone make money doing it. So
really and of course, the irony is that really to make it, to get off the ground as a working band, you have to be able to play, live. You have to be able to do it live. Otherwise, there's almost no point. Like the rest of it is so fleeting that if you want to build a career out of it, that's the place to start. And so this infrastructure around where you learn your craft and put in the graft, I think is crumbling around us, which is definitely a huge worry, for sure. And I don't know what we can do about it. I mean, we don't have a particularly sympathetic government in the UK to the arts. I think they're being seduced by tech like everybody else, and listening to those conversations that seem to be happening on some sort of bigger, grander scale than the idea of keeping your local arts center or youth center open. But I think what's happening is that there are people are helping themselves at the grassroots level. I mean, there's a really good example. I actually talk about it in my first book in around record retailing. So there's a record store, an independent record store that's in a town down the road from me, which is a kind of peripheral shopping town on the edge of London. It's called Kingston. And it's called Banquet Records. It used to be a relationship with the record label Banquet, but that split off, I think, a couple of decades ago. And the team that owns the store also has a really good relationship with 4 venues around the town. It has a nightclub, a church, to your point earlier, and a couple of bars. Like 4 or 5 venues. And they've managed to get a series of bands just coming through the system when they're releasing records. And this is bands that like can be Bruno Mars and Ed Sheeran. I'm not kidding you. Are playing circuit. This, I think maybe it's a 700-800 capacity nightclub in this town just down the road from me. And why are they doing it? Well, they're doing it because they've tied together this idea of launching your record in the store, doing a meet and greet, doing some signings, selling a whole bunch, doing a gig while you're here. So, see these beautiful tour buses parked outside this nightclub. Do a short gig and you get in the charts because the chart rules are, you get a bump in points for selling physical products and vinyl product. And you shift a couple of thousand there through working with Banquet Records, bundle in with a ticket. Next week, you're number 1 in the chart. It's a fantastic innovation. And I mean, I look at that and I think there is hope. What I don't see is enough investment going into that grassroots of the business. And it's a real shame. And I don't know how to fix it, to be honest. When you talk to investors, they kind of glaze over if it's not a $100 million deal and has AI tacked on the end of it,
Yeah. Sad but true. What defines success for an artist or a band these days, in your eyes?
Yeah, it's a big question, and it's one that I love to ask. And, the answer tends to be some sort of intrinsic value from doing what they do, making art, making music, engaging with the crowd at a gig, making eye contact with a fan, getting messages from fans about songs that have changed their lives in some way, meeting lifelong friends, all the intrinsic stuff that comes from making art is what I find that artists get in touch with, and they lose the plot along the way, usually because they get kind of groomed or gaslighted by the music industry with a different set of success metrics, which are chart hits or streaming numbers or awards, this kind of thing. This existential need around making art gets really skewed by the idea of commerce. And for a while, artists tend to lose the plot and they focus their affirmation and their success on something else. And then ultimately they realize that benefited them, but it wasn't about them. What was about them is the music they make and the relationship they have with the fans. And they go back to that full circle. And I love seeing that. And it's a very consistent story. It's almost a cliched story, but everyone has a different version of the cliche. And that's what I like to explore. So I think ultimately success is making a living out of doing what you love and having points along the way where you're enjoying that struggle, because it's a struggle. It's like all creative life to some extent is, it is, as we said, this existential struggle. It's a struggle when you get started because you want recognition. Then when you get recognition, it's a struggle because you want to go back to the start and be authentic. And it just goes round and round in circles.
Yeah.
But you choose a creative life and you leave a creative legacy, and I think, and you make a lot of people happy and touch a lot of people's lives, and that's what people come back to.
I don't know if I read this someplace or someone told it to me. I wish I could remember the source, but It was the best definition I can think of for success in the modern era of music. And that's making a living is the new success.
Yeah. It definitely is. Being able to give up the day job.
Yeah.
That's the ultimate, that's the new dream.
Yeah.
You know, we all talked about the middle class artist at some point when digital music kind of came along. And now I think it really is the working class artist. I think that's where we've got to. And it's a huge achievement, I think, because at the end of the day, you've got to think, and especially with costs going up, cost of doing everything, cost of making a record, cost of touring, cost of gear, everything's going up and up. And so, you know, the artist is the center of that economy. No matter how small, it's the artist is the center of that ecosystem. So I think it's a huge achievement that at the end of the day, an artist can say that they're making a living, because ultimately, if they are making a living, they're providing a living for the ecosystem and a bunch of people who work around them and with them. So that's the thing. It's not like they're just self-employed sole traders who can get by doing advisory work or, you know, I mean, I guess they can write songs and they can do masterclasses and things like that. And a lot of artists do. They have these sideline businesses where they're trying to cover the bases of all the possible revenue streams they can make. And there aren't enough hours in the day. But, you know, with their success is a bunch of other people's success as well. And I think that's the thing we forget when you get to the hedge fund gangsters and the tech investors, is they're not even thinking about that.
Yeah, right. Have you ever noticed that mixing vocals is often the hardest part of getting a track to sound right? You boost, you compress, you add effects, and it still doesn't feel professional. So, to make it easier, I put together a simple mini course on vocal mixing that walks you through the exact steps to get the vocals sounding clear and upfront. If you're interested, scan the QR code on screen or click the link in the show notes. Now, back to today's conversation. Well, let's go back a little bit. You talked about your first album, your first book about the album. Do you feel that the album has been, well, I know it's been de-emphasized in a way, at least in some circles, but do you feel like there's a comeback with the value of the album?
Yeah, don't call it a comeback.
Yeah,
the
you're
minute
right.
you say it's a comeback, you know,
You're right.
you find it doesn't, it starts to disappoint. It's like when you know, an artist gets a great song, like, don't call it a hit. Don't even talk about it possibly being a hit. You'll curse it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what there is a groundswell, and that's really interesting to me, because in the first place, the reason I wrote the book Body of Work is I couldn't believe that the album was still around. First of all, after 25 years of being in the business, since the year 2000, when everything got turned around, you know, Napster, iTunes, streaming, TikTok, and now AI, you think, well, 25 years of that, why are we even still having this conversation about albums? Why are we buying them? Why is it the release cycle that continues to drive the artist's next stage, and their whole touring cycle still kicks in around the album, even though when no one's listening? And then, so I wanted to dive into that and figure out, well, are people listening? And what I found is that, you know, mostly through anecdotal research, trends, evidence that you see, that you observe, rather than data that you look at on a chart, is just an immense love for the format amongst artists and amongst fans. I think it sort of started to come back. I gauge it between two Harry Styles albums. You know, in 2022, he released Harry's House. And it was on vinyl and everything like that. But the main kind of launch, I remember, was an article in Homes and Gardens magazine, which I thought was quite a cool idea. Like, get out of the claustrophobia of the music industry. Do your lead piece in a completely different, you know, lifestyle magazine. He's quite clever like that. But when he launched this new album, Kiss All the Time, Disco Occasionally, it was launched with listening parties in 40 cities around the world. A huge logistical operation to get people to listen to the record. Of course, there was a Netflix special of him playing the album start to finish at the Co-op in Manchester. And so album culture has definitely bounced back in the last 3 or 4 years. And that's something I wanted to celebrate and explore, why has that happened? And I do set a lot of credit on Taylor Swift for Folklore and Evermore, released during the pandemic and surprised a lot of people, got her fan base back into the possibility of telling a different story, different genre, really well put together album that, has that narrative around it, almost a concept album, not quite. And then, of course, Charli XCX with Brat, just this proof that an album can be a cultural phenomenon and can become a kind of water cooler moment that everybody knows about and that people want to jump on the bandwagon for. We haven't had a record like that for so long. The kind of thing where it keeps on selling and selling and people, are still checking out the format, still talking about it, still going to the shows, loving the songs. Olivia Dean, The Art of Loving, same kind of achievement. So the more titles that we see like that, I think bring the concept back and help it survive, but also help it thrive. And I feel like what's happening with artists at all tiers, but even like that top superstar tier, is there's a great creative race, to make a really good record. And for them, they're kind of looking back, they're standing on the shoulders of the giants that they love, the Elton Johns, the Aretha Franklins, that's who they look to. And they all made great albums. Their career was plotted through albums. So that's how we understand them. And I think all artists want a piece of that. So it's kind of like their antidote to what's going on with, the doom scroll and the daily post on social media,
Yeah. I mean, you have this dichotomy where streaming is not emphasizing the album. Obviously, it's emphasizing single songs. And yet you have this whole album culture where people still do buy albums and they buy the physical format just for the album. And it's, in some ways, especially if you're leaning tech, that's hard to reconcile, I think, because a tech person would say, well, why would you even think about that when you can get, all the songs, over here? But I think the tactile portion of an album, of a physical album, is still important to people. Do you find that?
Yeah, it's really important. Yeah, it's probably, the central thing. Well, I think there's two central things. The artist's belief in the format in terms of knowing that they have to make an album to be able to write some good songs. It comes in batches. You can't just do it one by one. They tried that during the iTunes era and it failed. There was never a success in trying to do that. And then with fans, it's a bit more complicated because we've had something else pushed on us. We've had the engagement model pushed on us and the feed, pushed to us, and we've kind of accepted it because we're human beings and it's addictive. And I think it takes time for people to realize what's good for them and what's nourishing for them. And one of those things is definitely, and everybody tells you this who does it occasionally. I'd like it to be regularly, takes a record home, takes it out the sleeve, puts it on the turntable and drops the needle on the groove. It's a great experience, actually, but you have to put the effort in order to get the utility and the enjoyment out. And the more you do it, the better it gets. The more you listen, the better the album gets. And this is for young people to discover. So I'm almost envious that, they're going to discover this and they're going to realize that actually this is way better than a playlist. It's different. It makes me feel better than a social scroll. And I think it's going to continue. So for me, that little bit of history that I wrote into the book as to okay, if this format that was invented by the consumer in the 20s and 30s, formalized by the industry as a tech format, invented by Columbia Records, when record companies invented stuff. So it is a tech format by any measure, It's just one that stuck. And in the end, I just really love the fact that would mystify the tech bros. I mean, right. I worked at Spotify. I worked with tech companies, with streaming companies. When you talk to them about the subject of the album, I remember bringing up anniversaries being a great occasion to push albums. And you got to get the glazed look would come over the eyes, and they'd switch off and probably start thinking about, I don't know, data or something. And I'd move on and be like, okay, maybe not, and it just delights me that they couldn't kill it.
Well, speaking of tech and formats, what's your take on immersive music?
I think it's interesting. I feel like it's at the beginning of something. I don't know how well it's going to catch on because it's been on the outskirts for a while. But I was speaking actually at the London Experience Week a couple of weeks ago, and before that another conference, Remix, and I can tell you that these conferences are much more exciting than going to a music industry conference, where you end up having a conversation about streaming fraud or AI or how screwed the industry is on some level. The guys who are running the experience economy are having a different conversation. It's all about the use of technology to build new experiences. It's all about the use of space and innovative use of alternative spaces, sometimes purpose-built spaces. Like what's going on with these spheres and things is quite interesting to me. A new dimension in sound and visuals, these kind of exhibitions that are going on. Some of them are succeeding, some are not. But it feels really, really exciting. It feels like a new way to explore art and music. So I feel it's a good thing. I'm really excited about things like listening bars popping up here in London. And I don't know what's going on in LA. I'm sure there are some. Because this is a trend that kind of began in Japan with the Kisa tradition, again, back in the pre-war years, where they'd listen to jazz albums in bars and really focus on the listen, no talking. You could sip a whiskey and soda, but, that was just about it. And that's great, too. That's coming back. They're cropping up all over London and the UK. I think New York as well. So keep an eye on that trend. I think it's great, but I don't think it's going to replace our listening. But if it makes an event of listening, and if you have to get out somewhere to be able to listen to a record from start to finish without, fiddling with your phone, if you feel that that's what you need to do it, because it's a great experience.
I agree, but the environment is important, as you mentioned. I think one of the size of it, and I know a lot of people that are heavy into it, and I'm talking about mixing for immersive music. Their experience is an experience that the average listener will never have.
Yeah.
And that's what disappoints me, because you can't, it's very hard to hype something that you can't experience.
Yeah. I think it's got to be almost sold as, look, this is the event. You come to this, you travel to it. It's not ABBA Voyage. It's not going to be something that's always going to be tens of millions as a spectacle. And, you pay a heavy ticket price for it. It might be that you pay, $25 to go into an immersive sound studio and listen to a Pink Floyd's, Dark Side of the Moon or whatever from start to finish. And it's only ever going to be a niche attraction. But I still feel like it's important that it's there as an option. And I feel like it's an important part of the industry that artists love and would like to tap into, because it kind of reignites the relationship with the music. It's like going to a really good talk, a Q&A about the making of a record, where it just deepens your appreciation of the thing. So even if you don't hear it in that format again, or you even, you just get a flavor of it being re-released and talked about in that format, you at least go back to the record and you remember how great it is, so that you should listen to it.
In your book, you write about the 5 routes to longevity that an artist or a band may take. Can you explain that?
I wrote the book after 70 episodes of The Art of Longevity. And that was kind of when I started the book. By the time I finished, I'd done 80 because I was still continuing with the occasional series. And it was a tough one because I don't want the book to be a kind of 101, this is how you get your music out on streaming platforms, or, you know, how you make it in the music business. It's not about that. Neither is it Rick Rubin's The Creative Act, you know, which is a kind of more of a religious philosophy.
Yeah.
I was looking for something in between, which is sort of like a roadmap of encouragement for artists of all stages, but particularly emerging, developing, aspiring artists who look at the music industry now and they just go, this is so complicated. And I've got so many choices. I don't know what to do next. You know, someone's telling me I need to post on my Instagram every day. Someone else is telling me I need to release my songs in stems or get people to remix it, or maybe I should just lock myself in a room for a year and practice. They don't know what's going to work. So I just wanted to look at, well, what are the common characteristics around people who've survived for, you know, anywhere between kind of 4 albums and, you know, in the case of, you know, Gary Newman, maybe 20 albums and 50 years in the game. So that's who I've been interviewing, you know, anything between kind of established artists who've crossed the Rubicon and legends. What's the common ground? What's the common roadmap? So they're the 5 routes, which is a hit song, a classic album, being dropped by your label, becoming a cult artist, or building your brand. And the thing is that each of those is quite a big topic, right? So if you just take one, like having a hit song, I look at the past, present, and future because it's really all changed. You know, it used to be a hit that was, you know, you'd get in the Billboard Top 100 or you'd get high up in one of the alternative Billboard charts. Here in the UK, you'd have a top 20 hit. That could guide your career on for the next 10 or 20 years, potentially, the halo effect of that. And now that's all changed. You can have a hit through what is essentially a streaming hit. You know, what is a streaming hit? So I'm trying to sort of break down, well, what is a streaming song? Or maybe even what is the song that your fans sing back to you, you know, the loudest at your shows? That's your hit. And that's what you work with to kind of move your career forward. So everything's changed. Every one of those routes has changed in some way. So it was an exploration of the kind of past, present, and future of those 5 routes. And the one that I really wrestled with was live performance, because, you know, as I said before, that's where every artist has to kind of, you know, prove their chops live these days if they want to kind of grow a really solid fan base. But then I thought there are so many live bands that have not made it in any other way. Like they're just known for just playing on the circuit almost constantly. And no one knows who they are. They don't release records. They don't get on the radio. There's a bunch of bands like that. So I put live as a kind of the first 20 themes of longevity, you know, because that's the second part of the book. You know, you've got to be able to play great live, but that's not the thing that's going to guarantee you longevity or crossing the Rubicon in the longer term. It's got to be a combination of those 5 routes. There could be more. That's just where I landed.
Yeah, I find one of the most interesting ones is, and probably confusing if you don't read the book, would be being dropped by a record label. And to think, well, wait a second, how could that be a sense of a source of longevity for me? So can you go there, please?
Yeah, this is a really popular one. When I've done this talk in record labels, a couple of majors, I've talked about the book. They've been great about it. Actually, they completely understand it, because to be dropped anyway, you have to be signed in the first place. So I'm really using that chapter as a way of explaining the label's role in the artist's career now, which is, you know, it's different than what it used to be. We kind of know that story, but specifically, what I found is it's a very typical characteristic of the artistic person is to bounce back in adversity, and being dropped is adversity. It's very disorientating. It's heartbreaking sometimes. You feel like it could be the end, but then you're an artist. So what are you going to do? You're going to prove your label wrong. And in most cases, and I pull out a bunch of case studies in the book where the very next thing the artist does is make the best record they've made since the debut, or since the thing that got them signed in the first place. And it becomes a creative success and a commercial success. And it's either with another label or they've done it independently, but it kind of is a big, F you to the label that dropped them. And I know it's unfair because at the end of the day, we're talking about parting ways. And that's what happens in, the creative and commercial world of the music industry. Is a kind of, they're awkward bedfellows, and something happens and they part ways. And ultimately the message, I think, to labels is that in today's business, especially, if that happens and you're going to drop artists, have a system whereby you do it with as much mutual respect as possible. Mediation, maybe, like a company does with, when employees exit, have an exit plan. You want to still have a good relationship with that artist, and maybe even invite them back into the fold later on when it's a better time and, things have changed and people have changed. So yeah, it's this idea, when you get dropped, don't see it as failure. Don't get too despondent. It could be a turning point. And it usually is.
That's a good one. All right, last question. In your research for the book and writing the book, you discovered a lot about artists and bands, both what they know and what they don't know. That if you were to advise an artist, would be the most important thing that they probably are not aware of?
The thing that I'm advising artists now, all of the work in the book and looking at everything that's changing in the business is, and it's a difficult one because it means you have to find someone else to work with you, or appoint someone in the band to be essentially a creative director. And maybe you need to appoint someone in the band to be your commercial director as well. And these are different from your manager. Remember, your manager, should you be lucky enough to get one or graduate to a point where you have one, is going to be hustling on your behalf day to day, just looking after what literally is happening in your world that week. And it's a full-time job. They're probably managing more than just your band. And they have their own life and they have to worry about their own, career and family. So the artist or the band has to have a way of translating your vision to all those that are going to represent you. And it's no longer the case that labels are going to pick that up. It's just not that environment anymore. Marketing's too optimized. It's too fast. They're releasing too many things. You live and die by the next hit. And that's not going to translate to a career for you, the artist. Still, you've got to present your music and your brand in the best possible way on all these platforms. Turn the equation around a little bit. You're not the slave to the platforms just giving them the content. They are in your service to build your brand. And the only way you're going to do that is by thinking like you are the creative director of a brand. And it gives you an opportunity, I think, to work in the way the business allows you to now, which is just be so great and work so hard that you can't be ignored, first of all, because that's the equivalent to being spotted by a radio DJ or a playlist curator, one of the gatekeepers that can drive you crazy if you think that you need to get through gatekeepers. Look after your brand from day one and just try and grow it. First of all, on a small scale, and then as it builds, look after it and make sure that you're presenting your image, your music in the best possible light. And for the best social media platforms, the social media accounts I see of artists are those who've got a great photographer, who just like, okay, it looks great. It looks pro. It looks like you're enjoying yourself. You look like you could be a legend. Then you're on your way. But if everything's looking scrappy and it's different from one day to the next, and it looks like somebody's told you it's a good idea, but it's maybe not such a good idea, all that stuff is the sort of thing that your fans figure out instantly. It's not authentic. Get a creative director, appoint one from within the band, or get a friend to join you for the ride.
Well, we could keep on going on and on. I think I hit about half my questions here, but how can people get the book?
I think you can get the book in Barnes and Noble. I prefer it if you buy the book or just order it through your independent bookshop or record shop. I think some record stores have been selling it. And if you really need to do it, get it on Amazon. It's right there. So it's got distribution, which is good. It's on a small publisher, so it's like the equivalent of being on a small indie label. But the advantage is they have distribution, so it should be easy to find.
It's a good place to stop, I think. Thanks for listening and being in my inner circle. Remember, if you have any questions or comments, you can send them to questions@bobbyowsinski.com. You can also learn all about the latest in music, audio, and production news, and find out about openings for my latest online classes at bobbyowsinski.com. This is Bobby Owsinski. I will see you next time